I can have your attention, please. I must welcome all of you. Thank you so much for being here, and especially we welcome Dr. Gammanpila. And we're grateful that you are here to share with us your expertise, but also your experiences of life and your experiences as a model, as a global Nomad. This is an important conversation that is going to be the style a bit of Dr. Dakshina will be sharing with us parts of what she has written in her book, part of what she has experienced in the 3 continents where she has lived, and she is surrounded today by all of us, but also by her husband and her son. Once again, thank you so much, and thank you all of you for coming. Please help me to welcome Dr. Dakshina.
Welcome, and thank you for joining us. I'm going to apologise, start off with an apology for my sore throat. I've been talking quite a lot in the last few days, so if it's a little bit raspy, this isn't gin, this is warm water. I do beg your forgiveness on that. And I'd like to extend my thanks to you and to Jesus and you, actually, with St. John's Community. One of the reasons that I was delighted to be invited to come and speak to you was because of the strong sense of community that I've seen extended from friends. And I've been very fortunate to experience that strong sense of community in places where I've lived and worked. In Brazil and in India and my motherland of Sri Lanka. At their heart is generosity of spirit, time, sharing food, warmth, and stories. And I think many of you, from your own heritage, wherever you call home around the globe, will know what that means, especially as expats. You create your tribe as an expat, your community, and making connections, and building relationships. And in some cases, community is an imperative. It offers a lifeline. I'm sure if you think back to the times where you've moved, finding your tribe means that you've arrived. So I'd like you to bring into your mind what community means to you. Just hold that thought and sit with it for a moment. What community means to each of you, and it could be very different. It could very well be this place here. It could be your friendships, work. So I'm going to read now from the introduction to Southside Stories to sort of give an explanation of the why and the what of this. And a little bit, I suppose, about me and why you might be here and might be interested. So, I'm a Southsider, a girl of the Southern Hemisphere, raised in the south of England, where I later returned with my husband to set up home in a leafy part of South London, not West London. We moved to Brazil and lived in Southlake, Lago Sul, in the capital city, and then onwards to South Delhi, where I'm typing this introduction. Interestingly, we're now living in South Brussels, so there is obviously a thing going on there. In all of these changing locations, with their varying identities, cultures and outlook, my southernness has seemed to be, if not a moral compass, something of a rough guide, a lens that gives me my view askew perspective on current affairs, community and everyday madness. My southern identity is also reflected in my name. Although I grew up understanding that Dakshina means gift from the heavens, which I now think is my father's rather daughter-centered translation, in Sanskrit it means offering. And here in India, where I write, the Hindi interpretation of Dakshin means of the south. From India, drifting even further south like a pearl in the Indian Ocean, is my motherland of Sri Lanka, which remains a defining characteristic of my identity and my writing. My Sri Lankan blood is clearly marked type S. So it was perhaps no surprise that when I first started writing my columns in Brazil in 2010, it became known Southside Stories. The column was perhaps an inevitable consequence of a professional life in which the written word had always loomed large. I'm less of a wordsmith, more of a word junkie, and as a former criminal barrister, my training centred on words. Words used in affidavits, in pleadings, in the courtroom, in trials. And after I lapsed as a barrister, I entered academia for a while and co-opted the written word, about 100,000 of them, to defend my PhD in forensic medicine and occupational cultures. So imagine 100,000 words to support one idea. Later in coaching and writing speeches for high-performance executives, diplomats or ambassadors, it was all words, words, words. So why not pursue writing as an aim in itself? And the opportunity came during 6 wonderful years that I spent in Brazil. I'd moved there in 2007, and amongst various projects, I was given the opportunity to observe and reflect on life as a global nomad in Brazil. And that was in the form of a weekly column. An expat from England with Sri Lankan blood in South America. How crazy could that be? Well, this chameleon tendency has enabled me to live in between and observe both inside out and outside in. In contrast to the perspective of a fixed resident, I come at issues as what the writer William Dalrymple described as an income. And he used that phrase in an endorsement of a book that I contributed to in 2016, and it was this idea of fresh eyes. And we're all like that. We all go to a place like a child almost, with those fresh eyes, and curious. And so part of the motivation to write was born out of my fascination with a new place and new and seductive stimuli. And I wanted to describe and explore and connect with my surroundings. But despite the newness and novelty and glorious differences that I discovered, I often found myself drawn to that which unites us and makes us human. Friendship, beauty, community. And they exist all over the globe. We all seek the same opportunities and love and respect, although sadly, equality is a stage we have yet to reach. Writing makes things permanent, and I'm grateful to the column for capturing 3.5 years of moments. They provide a piece of evidence, and a lawyer by heart, I guess, loves evidence. But it's a footprint that might have been washed away by the sands of time and busyness and the distraction of new wonders and horizons. And yet their meaning continues to shift as I look back on them now as a more seasoned mother, nomad and woman. Once again, my perspective has gone south, and with age, other things may have gone south as well. Let me get my drift. This selection of 28 articles is drawn from a series of around 60 columns written between 2010 and 2013. And when I'm reading a little later, I'd love you to just remember 2010 and what the world might have been like then. It's not a memoir. It's a collection of shades from a palette coloured by the experience of creating a new home on new shores, experiencing transition, trying to make sense of it all, and being embraced by strangers, and sometimes let down by those charged with caring for us. In returning to the articles nearly a decade after they were birthed, it was insightful to see broad themes emerge that seemed to be significant for global nomads like us. So I decided to curate a tasting menu that was thematic rather than chronological. And my serving suggestion for this menu of small bites is that they're not supposed to be consumed in one sitting, like a meal. That way indigestion lies. The suggestion is that you just dip into them slowly when the mood takes you. The collection opens with a series I call Love Letters, and I was writing for a mixed international community and a Brazilian readership, but the column, interestingly, was published by the American Embassy. And I did want to celebrate my love of things American. You can hear I'm British Sri Lankan, but I studied UK and US politics at A level, and then went on in my law degree to look at the Pentagon Papers and Spycatcher, and then as a young barrister travelled to the US and visited the Supreme Court. And to me, I felt it was this incredible place, the Bill of Rights and everything that stood for. So I did start with this homage, if you like, to America, but also the fact that the American community had welcomed this British family, British Sri Lankan family, into their midst. But I also wanted to confront some difficult issues. So I wrote about traditions, festivals, but just like a good cappuccino, has more intense body underneath the foam. Perhaps I'm more of a barista than a barrister. I also wanted to confront and explore the related darker issues I encountered, such as justice, race relations, and history. Inevitably, I also wanted to unearth how global nomads deal with fundamental themes of roots, of home, of friendships, love, and community. Such issues are part of the daily reality of expats, and perhaps help non-expats understand us better. I discovered that friends sometimes showed the articles to loved ones and family back home when they found it difficult to communicate some of the highs and some of the lows, and they're both. We live in this, that we experience. The column was a conduit and something that I never contemplated. And in fact, I never really considered who was reading Southside Stories for a long time. I didn't write the column with anyone particular in mind, no one audience that I sought to reach or impress or insult. I'd pull my musings together, sometimes with a toddler on my knee, and that toddler is over there. On the knee, not so much now, but or his big sister at school age, she was 5, 6 at the time, would run in and ask me, "So, Mummy, what are you writing about this week?" But I'd pull my musings together and throw an article into the ether and deal with whatever logistical, everyday challenge that mums have when you're living and working overseas. It was something of a shock when I learned that real people read the thing and had an opinion about it. And it was more numerous and diverse a crowd than I had imagined. At a party, an ex-Marine introduced himself to me as one of your dear and lovely readers, and I used to start the column, dear and lovely, dear and patient, dear and enduring. And it was marvellous to me because we were so very different. I remember Randy talking about, and he actually quoted line for line a paragraph of the column. And a European ambassador confided in me that he would print off the article on a Friday evening and read it in the bath with his gin and tonic. And he said, to make me think and laugh and set myself up for the weekend. And he was an amazing ambassador. It happened to be Dutch, very direct. And that was in Brazil, and then he came and visited when we were in India, and actually said, "Are you still writing? And are you still getting people into trouble?" I didn't get people into trouble, I wasn't quite. But it was lovely that fellow global nomads, like we all are in this room, just nodded in recognition. You know, those aha moments when you realise that other people feel what you feel and are going through what you're going through. Because the column was at heart all about that, making connections between me and a place, me and you, and moving beyond us and them. So if you have experience of travel in unfamiliar surroundings and making new friends, new communities and new lives, this collection of articles may resonate with you. And it doesn't seek to take itself too seriously. I'm the same. We can't. Life is a wave, and we have to ride it or go through it in whatever way we can. And humour, I think, is a big part of that. But it also may illustrate that one person's chaos is another person's normality, that the magic of stories helps us to navigate our worlds and cross cultures, and that we can find beauty and wonder both in the unusual and the everyday. And I dedicated this first collection to my parents, because they were the first global nomads that I ever knew, who made a life from the 60s onwards on 3 continents without the safety net that we have of technology and easy travel. They're a remarkable one-off couple, heroes and pioneers, and my father, who's no longer with us, inspired so much of my writing and my life, and my son. He is the essence of my dad, I have to say. And my mother, who I spoke to, she's 81, she's just flown over today to Sri Lanka, and I spoke to her. And she's simply the strongest person I know. I have to say, she's flown over, it makes it sound like she's, on a plane, not with wings, although you never know with my mum. She's a fabulous angel. And I really wanted to thank sort of feedback that I'd had. We had a little soft airing of this at the US Embassy in India, and it was really wonderful to have very different nationalities in the room, men and women, different stages in their career, and all again just resonate with them, and there was laughter, and actually there was tears, and sometimes the tears came from the men who realised, wow, we've gone through this, and also from men and women who were the officers, if you like, who were the diplomats, who maybe had not appreciated what it is like for the accompanying partners to go and forge a life elsewhere. So, that really was the why and the what. And we're going to look at a few of the themes this evening, and kindness comes up. And we hear that word kindness all the time, particularly if you're in education. It's very important, but it's also interesting that it was voted in the UK the Word of the Year 2024, and that's just this last week come out, from children of the ages between 6 and 14. And a 7-year-old girl on the BBC News said, what prompted her to select the word kindness? And she said simply that, well, people are not being nice to each other. It's from a 7-year-old. And I'm just going to throw this open. Can you guess what some of the other words might have been that they were considering? No wrong answer, it's not a test.
Compassion.
Compassion. Great.
Happiness.
Happiness.
Inclusion.
Inclusion.
Empathy.
Empathy. Anything?
Tolerance.
Gratitude. Tolerance. Gratitude. Okay. A couple of the other words they had considering for last year. Artificial intelligence, I know it's 2 words. And conflict.
I was thinking chaos. Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to just go back on a couple of the other words that they selected. 2020, no surprise, coronavirus. 2021, anxiety. Think of the age group again. 2023, climate change. Prior to that, bearing in mind these are UK children, 2019 was Brexit.
Yeah.
2018 was plastic. Think about David Attenborough and his campaign to clean up the oceans. Plastic was a very big thing in that year. Trump, 2017, and 2016 refugee. Again, very interesting, these words. But the word was kindness, which I think was very positive for last year. 61% of this age group came up with kindness. But kindness isn't just a word, is it? It's an action. And I think that's really something that has struck home to me and to our family, and to yours, I'm sure, over your time away. And this next bite is called The Kindness of Strangers. The season of goodwill always brings to mind acts of kindness. In childhood, we're taught the virtues of being kind, simply for kindness' sake. Flossie, be kind to your little brother. Timmy, be kind to your friends at school. Johnny, don't pull your sister's hair, the legs off the spider, the pin out of that grenade. It's just not kind. It's one of the precepts that set us apart from many creatures, although I guess the tacit promise of a pride of lions not to attack and eat one another could be considered a kindness of sorts. Being kind is established in us at an early age, yet youth and the young may not deem it a cool trait, and kindness seems to fall down the list of the desirable and displayed in an overseas posting. It's a must, and I'm going to apologise to my son in advance. This was written in 2019, and I don't think, sorry, this was written much earlier than that, and this collection was put together in 2019, but I think kindness is very much front and centre of young people today. My parents had the opportunity to study medicine in Moscow in the 1960s, and they were given a healthy scholarship and a hero send-off. They were actually sent off by the Prime Minister to go and fly the flag for Sri Lanka. Off you go to start your new life in a strange land, new language, new alphabet, new climate, new culture. From Sri Lanka to the USSR in a trice. Think about that in the very early 1960s. Just in terms of weather, Brussels gives us four seasons in one day sometimes, and just think of that in terms of the culture shock. And my mum was there in a sari. We have pictures of her in Moscow with my dad in a sari. Perhaps the opportunity they were given could be interpreted as political. Everything that is these days is politics centres on spin and less on substance. But it was so much more. Medicine is universal. The human body is pretty much the same underneath all that skin and hair. And that's how they saw it. Friendship is the same, and so too is kindness. During their time in the Soviet Union, they were adopted by Russian families. And I remember a beautiful photograph of my parents in the home of Russian friends, with their arms around each other, laughing and singing traditional Russian folk songs. I'm looking at Irina. They're still able to sing those songs. Later in England, their Russian medical professor and his wife and daughter, Lydia, had relocated, and they became my surrogate grandparents in the absence of my own, who were back in Sri Lanka, and whom I saw once every 4 years. I cast my thoughts back to our own arrival in Brazil as a family a few years back. A young family embarking on a new adventure. Little did we suspect that we, my husband, 3-year-old daughter and 6-month-old baby son, and I, along with our 13 pieces of luggage and head full of dreams and pocket full of nothing, actually it wasn't that bad, would spend 3 months in one hotel room in Brasilia. It happened to be the nicest hotel in the capital city, but it was one room, and we arrived in the middle of the dry season, and it was bewildering at best. We had no home, no language, neither of us spoke Portuguese or any Spanish root language. French, yes, but Portuguese was a whole different bag. No car, no family, and worst of all, no friends. We had to rely on the random acts of the community at large. And it seemed that we weren't on many people's radar. Our hotel staff, waiters, receptionists, and the like became warm and friendly points of contact in those first 3 months, when I was frequently asking myself, and I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, at some point in some distant posting, of course not in Brussels, have asked yourself, what am I doing here? Why? In those early days of new motherhood once again, and being a stranger in a strange land, I felt vulnerable. I had to keep it together and make it a happy experience for my children. And in the absence of a proper home and a community to connect with, a language with which to make that connection, the children made friends at the hotel, as did we, and became part of the furniture. They literally became part of the furniture. Our daughter was given a lovely desk behind the lobby at reception, and she learned Portuguese by mimicking. And I remember being in our room and she was ringing down to reception, sort of mimicking, talking to people. And I could hear this like lyrical, this little twittering voice, but this very lyrical cadence. And I said, "What are you speaking?" It was a made-up language. And she said, I'm Portuguesifying, Mummy. And she was. She just heard the sound. I mean, she's an amazing mimic, and she can mimic every accent, as can my son, in the UK just about. But it was that. She was learning by mimicking, and it was so wonderful because it actually gave me confidence to think, if she's learning like that as a 3-year-old, I can crack this. And we actually had to return home, return to that same hotel the following year, ironically, for the same 3 months, when I suffered a near fatal accident in our home. I'm smiling, heaven knows why. But as we were packing to go, and we had to go in the middle of the night, leave, and my daughter asked me, "Are we going to our adventure home, Mummy?" The resilience of a 4-year-old spoke volumes. She was able to turn the experience into a positive one, largely because so many people in the hotel were kind to her. When she's older, I will explain more fully how much her positive outlook helped our whole family at what was a very, very distressing time. But it was a question of perspective. I mean, she didn't know that word, of course, but that's what she was doing. She was putting a child's beautiful optimism on the situation. But for me, I mean, I had always been independent as an adult, professionally, financially, and emotionally. And now, in that situation, moving home, I was forced to relinquish control and put my faith, and moreover, the well-being of my children in someone else's hands. It was an alien concept. And the system was flawed. The lack of control in many ways was the hardest part. But once we made a decision to wrest back some of that semblance of control, at least in our own minds, things changed for the better. One day, a Brazilian colleague of my husband turned up in her car at the hotel. I can't recall everything we did with her that day. She took me and the kids. And it wasn't because it wasn't interesting, but I think I was so happy that I was overcome with gratitude. You mentioned that word, Rashna, which just superseded the activity itself. She showed us around Brasilia and her home, and most of all, she showed us an understanding of our situation. I'm going to skip a bit. But I would say that these acts of kindness were also adopted by bizarrely, the Sri Lankan embassy had opened in Brazil just months before we arrived, and we were walking distance of them. And I remember thinking when we left my parents in England, they were in England, that my children wouldn't have that Sri Lankan part of their heritage, only to find that our neighbours were Sri Lankan and that we were going to be adopted by them, to the point that I recall Kishan. He's here now, I might as well call him by his name. Kishan was ill with quite severe breathing problems when he was quite small, and unbeknownst to us at that point, he was to spend his first Easter in hospital back in the UK, as was I. But when he was experiencing slight recurring bouts of this breathing difficulty, I'd receive gifts of spices from the Sri Lankan embassy round the corner to concoct Ayurvedic remedies based on the system of Hemakada. It's a therapy akin to Ayurveda used in Sri Lanka. And in Brazil, we had 24-hour guards. And when I mean 24-hour guards, we had a rota of 4 guards on shift every month. And they looked like they were out of the Terminator. They were extraordinary. But gentle giants, men and women, doesn't even go far enough. They were extraordinary. And I used to say it was to protect Brazil from us rather than the other way round. But I initially think they were a little nervous of these deliveries of unmarked brown paper envelopes containing clear plastic parcels of seeds and unnamed herbs that was being chauffeured and almost silently delivered to Senora. But they soon became accustomed to my customs. and would hand over the packages with a smile, banishing their suspicions that I was perhaps running some illicit drugs cartel out of Largusor with my 2 kids as cover. But our paths only crossed with this incredible Sri Lankan couple for another 3 months, but it didn't matter. It was just such a short time, and I think we all find that intensity of those time-limited friendships that you might not have with friends that you spent a lifetime with. But these acts of kindness spoke to us on our own terms, as one human to another, not as people from a specific organisation or country, not as professionals with a diplomatic card or special entitlements. But these acts, every one a blessing, transcended the deeds themselves, and it restored my faith in human nature and the ability of people to step outside their own lives and concerns for no other reason than to offer their hand in friendship. Those hands grasped mine so strongly and yet so incredibly gently and led me into my new life that I now adore. And that was written in December 2010. So, going back to that idea of community, last year I wrote about community for a magazine. It was for diplomats and former diplomats and their families. And it was really about the power and the need for community. And the article, which I was told was sent to 270, I didn't even know we had this many, British embassies and consulates around the globe, stressed that we need community now more than ever. I really, truly believe that we need it, but we need it on the ground, face-to-face, hands-on kind communities. So again, remembering the image that I asked you to conjure up in your mind, looking at the word community. So it's made out of the word commune, which is a noun, a group of people living together, sharing possessions and responsibilities. Commune, we know this, very much in Brussels and Belgium. Territorial division. Communes share resources, amenities, rules and regulations. But my favourite is the verb, to commune, to share one's intimate thoughts and feelings and feel in close spiritual contact with something or someone, for example, communing with nature. And then looking at that idea of unity. So the idea of community and togetherness doesn't always come easy and can't be taken for granted, as was highlighted last week by Bishop Marianne Edgar Buddy on January the 20th, also known as Blue Monday. She said, unity is the threshold requirement for people to live together in a free society. It is the solid rock, not weary politeness. Sorry, it is the solid rock upon which to build a nation. It is not conformity. It is not a victory of one over another. It is not weary politeness, nor passivity born of exhaustion. Unity is not partisan. Rather, unity is a way of being with one another that encompasses and respects differences, that teaches us to hold multiple perspectives and life experiences as valid and worthy of respect, that enables us in our communities and halls of power to genuinely care for one another, even when we disagree. It's so powerful. And the idea of speaking truth and home truths to power is paramount, especially in unsettled times. I think one of the privilege that I felt, and I didn't realise it fully at that time, but in writing the column, was that Southside Stories provided an opportunity from 2010 onwards in Brazil and then later in India, where I resurrected the column, to take a lighter look at expat life, but also to push some buttons. Then this next bit is called grey matter. Part 1. I'm not going to read parts 2, 3 and 4, don't worry. Grey matter. Dear and forgiving reader, I've taken my eye off the ball, so to speak, and have not offered up the crumbs of my scribbling for some weeks. I've singularly failed to hold up the mirror to this strange and interesting life we lead here in BSB. BSB is not that other school. BSB is a shortened version of Brazilian, like BXL. My sincere apologies. I also promised to return to the light and frothy part of my cappuccino column. Again, heartfelt sorry. My Brazilian friends have quizzed me of late as to what is going on in Brasilia at the moment regarding the rash of questionable behaviour amongst assorted diplomats, politicians and the like. Discussions rage. I've remained tight-lipped to try and work it all out for myself. The media and the gossip mongers are doing enough to spread the word about the crimes and misdemeanours, the petty grudges, supposed cover-ups and corruption, name-calling and mudslinging that sadly besmirches our fair city. We need to call out such behaviour and not ignore it, lest it pollute what is right and good and we all become tarred with the same brush. That would be unforgivable, wouldn't it? Gone are the days of Teflon diplomacy when people could act in a way, in any way they chose, and be immune to the normal mores and decency of and honourable legal conduct. And if we're sensible, that's no bad thing. To have some credibility, there should also be a degree of transparency. And also, I would add some accountability and a bit of humility thrown in for good measure. It's not necessary to cite individual incidents. This sounds, and I can see it sounds a little bit like, what's her name? Lady Whistledown. If you know Bridgerton, this idea of, but you are the dear and gentle reader, of course. It's not necessary to cite individual incidents here. We all know of them and are a little disillusioned at the thought that yesterday's crimes are being repeated today and probably will be repeated again tomorrow. History should, after all, teach us something. Isn't that right, Ewan?
It's true.
Right? Yes. One of my favourite subjects of my son's. When I was a lawyer, I was concerned with two sides. My side and your side. The right and the wrong. Or the wrong and the right, which could be skewed for prosecuting and defending. One version weighed up against the other. In England, the legal system is adversarial. In other words, the lawyers are adversaries. They're in combat. If I argue black, then you must, of course, argue white. The US system is much more inquisitorial, although courtroom dramas would have us believe otherwise. And looking for the truth is what matters, and often lies in the shades in between. I soon realised how much of this adversarial posturing was a game when I was a young barrister. It was won or lost on technicalities, not on truth or the actual version of events. Thus, innocent people get castigated, and both the injured and the injuring party can be culpable. The injustice drove me to despise aspects of the justice system. Even a professional arguer knows when to let go, that the issue or person that is being argued with or about or over is simply not worth that argument, and that sometimes no one wins. Courtroom battles have similarities with those waged in war. Two sides with opposing views and ideals and different things to gain. But it is the collateral damage that is the hardest to explain and tolerate. In war, as often in the courtroom, those who get hurt time and time again are the innocent, men, women, children, and elderly, who have no power, no money, no position, and seemingly no rights. Now, remember when I'm writing this, I'll give you the date at the end. Last November, when I wrote about Remembrance Sunday, I talked of the beauty and the horror of war poetry. I recall a poem written by someone at the front line who had seen war and argument, had witnessed this played out as innocents lost their lives on a daily basis, and was frankly fed up. My 15-year-old self grasped the irony about which he wrote. the generals laughing and drinking in the safety of the back rooms, their distended back bellies barely covered by their overstuffed uniforms, decorated with medals for doing what? Making decisions based on power or reward, and sending, as was written in war poetry, young men up the line to death. Wars give nations and continents, and I read this to the military community, some military community here in Brussels, and they were really positive about this idea. Wars give nations and continents a bad name for generations. As someone whose own country, Sri Lanka, a paradise on earth by anyone's standards, was ripped apart by civil war for a generation knows. When we think of Sri Lanka, Vietnam, Biafra, Iran, Afghanistan, Iraq, Yugoslavia, I'm showing my age there, and we can now add further to that. Do we think of the beauty that those cultures have to share? Do we make our judgments palatable by focusing on the differences and not on the similarities between nations? Of course, we're only human if not humane. When I think of people who've taken a stand against injustice, who believed in rights and truth in modern times, three people spring to mind. Martin Luther King, you know, so these are obvious choices. Quick wins. Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, Mahatma Gandhi. Interestingly, they all share a legal background. In fact, one of the reasons I chose Inner Temple in London as my Inn of Court as a barrister was because of three people. Gandhi was an alumni, he was a barrister. Nehru was also a barrister. And interestingly, Jinnah, who became the first president of Pakistan, was also a barrister there as well. All three consummate barristers, but amazing politicians. And actually, out of the three, Jinnah was the politician. And I saw Gandhi as a barrister in my early 20s. I walked up the library steps and I see this huge portrait of him every day. These men believed in the power of words. They chose a different path. Peaceable, certainly dignified, action over inaction, decency over indecency, humanity over the inhumane, simplistic quietude over arrogance and vanity, wisdom over pettiness and jealousy. Gandhi, Mandela, and King believed that when injustice occurs, it should be spoken of and then acted upon. And although they did not promote fighting, these men were no cowards. They hid behind nothing and no one. They showed us that if we become mute, sweep the truth under the carpet, and simply pretend such things never happen, we become complicit, and the community as a whole is tarnished. Society as a whole is poorer for that. Recently, my family saw a wonderful open-air theatre version of The Emperor's New Clothes. You can see where I'm going with this. A fairy tale. If you're sitting comfortably, dear and childlike reader, I shall share this story with you. In a land far, far away, there lived an emperor. It could easily have been a king, or an empress, or a queen. After all, we believe in equality, don't we? This emperor's vanity knew no bounds. News of this reached the ears of a cunning pair of charlatans who instantly hatched a plan. They travelled to the city and spoke in flowery tones about their expertise as tailors, and that the cloth that they wove had magical properties. However, they asserted that this cloth could only be seen by the finest and cleverest of men and women. The tailors unravelled the bolt of fabric, and lo and behold, there was nothing to behold, nothing there at all. The emperor and his courtiers stumbled. They were flummoxed, bamboozled, and downright confused. But only for a minute. They suddenly recalled the words of the tricksters, and not wanting to appear fools, responded with countless superlatives as to the colour and the weight and the sheen of this invisible cloth. So involved were they that they forgot the truth and started to believe the tailor's hype. And so the emperor was duly measured, and a suit of nothing was expertly fashioned for him. Splendid. The day dawned for the royal birthday procession. Streets were thronged with people cheering and waving and extolling the merits of the emperor's stunning new outfit. All of a sudden, a little boy, of course it could have been a girl, but it happened to be a boy. Perhaps it was you. Look, look, the emperor is naked. He's got no clothes on. And the emperor looked down, and sure enough, he was naked. Not a sock or a monocle in sight, just a slightly skewed crown, with the shine a little worn. In his shame, he realized that he truly was a fool, commemorating the day of his birth by standing in front of thousands in his birthday suit. Even before the mirror in all his nakedness, the emperor had convinced himself about the fineness of his attire, and this lie was perpetuated and added to by all those who professed to serve him. The little boy, in his innocence, dared to point out the emperor's idiocy and part of the lie. Unwittingly, he declared that the emperor and all the people had been duped by the wicked and greedy tailors. But far from being punished for his insolence, the people were relieved. The little boy was only telling the truth, the naked truth, plain, for everyone to see. Dear discerning reader, don't read too much into this. It is, after all, a fairy story. The emperor could be a person, a place, an ideal. It could be all of us, if we let it be. It illustrates a simple rule of thumb. Above all, we should be representing humanity. Otherwise, we run the risk, like the emperor, of being exposed. I may be naive, but I'm good company. Truth is in the shades of grey, and when all is said and done, grey matters. And this was written in May 2012, but hey. A little bit about compassion, which Jesus, you mentioned. Underlying Bishop Buddy's words, whether you agree with her or not, is compassion, the cousin of kindness. Compassion is embedded in our nature, and it fosters care and loving kindness. It opens us up and nurtures our own and others' humanity. Finding that connection, and that word again, connection, between individuals and groups can be achieved via communities very much such as the one here at St. John's. It also counteracts isolation, and I think that's really important to stress that. Different types of isolation and loneliness and solitude in a posting, in an overseas mission. The author, Samantha Harvey, writes, "In loneliness and curiosity and hope, humanity looks outwards. Looking outwards and being curious, perhaps open to adventure, is part of our expat lives." I mentioned my parents leaving a tropical island for a snowy but beautiful Russia that they loved. And it must have seemed like space travel for them, making a new home elsewhere as first generation astronauts, pioneers. In Samantha Harvey's Booker Prize winning novel, and she speaks of space travel, and I immediately thought what it might be like and what it feels like to move overseas. She was talking about going up into space and looking back from afar. At first, think of yourselves, your own little unit in this. At first, on their missions, they each miss their families, sometimes so much it seems to scrape out their insides. Now, out of necessity, they come to see that their family is this one here. These others who know the things they know and see things that they see, with whom they need no words of explanation. When they get back, how will they even begin to say what happened to them, who and what they were? I think that probably also resonates with us, that idea of we may have these different countries that we travel to and live in for whatever period of time, but that going back home to your homeland may be the most difficult mission and experience that you experience, and I think that's something to hold in our mind, that we can be an alien in our own land. How are we doing for time? I have no idea.
Well, we have time.
Yeah.
We have time.
So this next piece is a little bit that you'll all understand, and it's called the Arrivals Lounge and Other Rituals. Today, I feel homesick. This time, it was triggered by a rare evening in watching a British costume drama. Saints preserve me if I haven't gone all nostalgic for the 1890s. Things are looking dodgy. As one of the characters remarked, "It's good to be homesick. It shows that you have had a happy home." I let my thoughts drift, not unusual, and my feelings, normally reined well in, run away with themselves. Sensing that the Pandora's box of homesickness had been opened, I quickly locked the trunk and put the key in its usual hiding place. Our rituals that we play out, as divine as any conceived for temple, church or mosque, gurdwara or synagogue. The Arrivals Lounge is to me a place of worship. I go through those doors at Heathrow and my excitement has no limit. I managed to bypass the Marks and Spencer food hall, a bugle call to England, and I sweep with my eyes the awaiting throng. I still adore being met by my parents at the airport. It's just like the opening scene from Love Actually, where 1,000 people are reunited after long flights. And that always has the saline pricking my eyes. Now, that arrivals hall in Heathrow is actually where they shot, I didn't appreciate this in, I think, 2012, that scene, that lovely, beautiful scene. It has the saline pricking my eyes, even more so now because my dad is no longer with us, but that ritual of that gorgeous first embrace after months and miles of separation is pure bliss. And particularly poignant, given the British aren't known for their public displays of affection. Apologies, all the Brits in the room. I delight seeing my husband give my dad a kiss, and my mum give him that look, which means our girl and her babies have been brought back to us. Our son-in-law is keeping those vows. Good boy. My children propel themselves forward, doing flying leaps into their grandparents' outstretched arms. Could those leaps be any faster? And could those arms be held out any wider? And that bone-crushing, spine-tingling squeeze. Skip some paragraphs. Your rituals will be different. The conversations on the front porch, the house on the lake, the family hierarchies and tensions. The first beer in your favorite bar, seeing the seasons, smelling coffee brewed in your parents' kitchen, watching the ball game, walking to your local grocery store and seeing the shelves stocked with all your familiar home comforts. And I write about home comforts earlier in the book. But all of us share the common ritual of having to part again from family and friends. As a girl returning to England from visits to Sri Lanka, this involved the preparation of countless foodstuffs to take back and get through customs. And I remember as a 7-year-old coming back just with my dad on the trip that we'd taken, the two of us, to see my grandmother, who was very seriously ill, and coming through customs at Heathrow with a full suitcase of things that were unexplainable to the guards in question. And I think they took out stuff from the suitcase and were so bewildered that they kind of repacked and said, off you go. Luckily for us, because the love and the care that had gone into preparing every single thing that went into that suitcase. And those foodstuffs to take back will be eked out slowly to preserve the memories. That journey to the airport, to another home, another life. No stiff upper lip for us, not even a trembling of the lower lip. Full scale weeping was on the menu. But somehow, as a little girl, I wasn't overwhelmed by it. It was part of the ritual, and it left me in no doubt that my family overseas loved me, and I occupied a huge and special place in their hearts and minds. In general, I didn't see my grandmothers for 4 years at a time, and in the interim, no Facebook, no Skype, no cheap calls. It's hard to imagine that for our children today, hard to imagine missing 16 seasons, countless Sunday meals, conversations unshared. My grandparents missed whole chapters of my story as I changed from baby to toddler, from girl to teenager, to woman, to wife, to mother. But although I was envious of classmates who could say glibly, "I'm just popping to my granny's after school," I also knew that I had a special bond with my grandparents. The intensity of the visits, the little notes signed from your ever-loving grandmother. She will always be so. And now, history repeats itself in a fashion. I will always remember how my parents received the news of our posting to Brazil. We're happy for you, and sad for us. What beautiful honesty, uttered with absolute knowledge. But there is an acceptance and a contentment of soul. When I watch my children with my parents, sharing stories and songs and I love yous with easy candour, I am filled with thankfulness. They are beloved, and such bonds transcend oceans. June 2011. I'm not reading the teary ones. One of the many things I've loved about living overseas has been meeting a vast array of fascinating people. And the stories about those encounters range from the sublime to the ridiculous and back, and I will share them another time. But as you may have gathered, I love language. And last month I was in a cafe with my gorgeous daughter here in Brussels, and she just looked up and she said, "Oh, Stromae is over there." She actually said Stromae, but I'm doing the French Belgian pronunciation, and she said, "Stromae's over there." And I didn't want to be a fangirl, but I ended up having a conversation with Stromae about language, saying that I had learned about him in a class when we had looked at his wonderful song, Formidable, that his play on words was so invigorating and lyrical in the truest sense, and that I was working with different nationalities on their English conversation. And the money from those classes was given to a school, École Maximilien, in the city, for refugees to learn French or Dutch. Language for them was essential to having a livelihood, to entering society, a way to overcome mental health conditions, loneliness, anxiety and stress, and above all, making a new life in a new land. Language is a lifeline, helping us to earn livelihoods and to integrate. During COVID, I was asked by students when we were living in India to write an article about parenting in the time of COVID. And I'm, as I said, a doctor of 2 daughters, and understand that STEM and science and technology are incredibly important. But what did we turn to in COVID? In our isolation, we found solace in books, in film, in music, in poetry and nature, and when we could, in social interaction that we had been starved of. I'm currently working on the collaborative project with my old law school, and it's about overcoming barristers. It probably is about overcoming barristers, actually, come to think of it. Overcoming barriers, again Freudian. And some of these barriers are societal and others can be self-imposed. But language is a key to unlock understanding. It's that which makes us human, makes connections, and overcomes isolation, and helps us tap into our resources and that of the community that we create. I have this phrase that I explain to the English students, and we have all continents represented in the class. And we are greater than the sum of our parts. And when we explained it, it's absolutely true. And I'm sure you feel that about St. John's. The power of language and arts and humanities and history are priceless and are encapsulated in stories. And we're often told now how important storytelling is to bring it down to the individual. And they are. I mean, they can entertain, they can teach, they can horrify and highlight. They pass down traditions and culture and our intangible heritage. They make the impersonal so very, very personal and give flight to our thoughts and allows us to share them. At the moment, I'm holding this health and well-being. It's a program for parents, and the group is extraordinary. We're working with a different group of lawyers and diplomats, professionals, those that are involved with the European Commission and health specialists, and the high-performance athlete as well. But everything that we talk about, it's all about stories. Yes, we're hooked to hang on is health and well-being and mindfulness, and however you want to pose it, but it's really about telling our personal stories, sharing not just to entertain, but to make those connections. And I'm going to be going to the UK and talking to university students next month, and it's all going to be about that. Talking about stories, thoughts, with uplifting and difficult themes. And I think that's the thing about stories, it's a way to introduce that which is heartbreaking to us as humans. It's all about connection. I've got a whole piece that I am going to not talk about, which is about nature and really connection in nature. We can take our cues from nature and mycorrhizal fungal networks, you know, this idea of this unseen subterranean network. And I'm not talking about one up there, the World Wide Web. I'm talking about the Wood Wide Web. That also is about communities and conversations and challenges and sharing of information. What is going on around the world, current affairs and anxiety, going back to the words that we heard those children choosing, they seem to go hand in hand. And children take their cues from adults and the world around them. And as adults, we need to own that. We have a non-negotiable responsibility to help them to be curious about the world and to try to understand it, even if we don't understand it ourselves. And I don't know about you, but I really do have that feeling at the moment. A desire to conquer or subdue, to say my way is better than yours, is the ultimate form of unkindness, to quote our lovely 7-year-old. People not being nice to each other. But adults too learn from children, and I know for me, my parents were amazing teachers, but my children are the biggest teachers that I've had. I think we're probably the recipient generation. And I have this final piece. So we've gone from grey matters, of course, we then have to go to dark matter. Part 1, the final frontier. All right, I've promised to return to the lighter side of things, dear and frustrated reader. Perchance you can paint this with a rose-tinted glow in a darker shade, say a tone of cerise or fuchsia. I crave your indulgence for yet another week, and hang my head, not for the first time, surely not the last. During our daughter's period of enforced convalescence, you'll like this one, she had a spider bite in Brazil. We were in Brazil after all. And we were on our terrace, and she suffered a spider bite, as did one of our lunch guests. Our daughter, brilliant little 7-year-old, did what she was told, all the medication and stuff that we had to do. Her counterpart, Mike, who now lives in Brussels, Uncle Mike, didn't, and was wondering why his leg was turning blue. But there you go, learning from children, right? During her period of enforced convalescence, my husband and I were drawn into her work on certain matter, dark matter to be exact, since her school project was located squarely in the realms of outer space. I can now tell you about quantum theory, black holes, the space race, and so on, albeit from the perspective of a 7-year-old, which actually proved far more sophisticated than my paltry knowledge. She can name constellations and talks of Higgs and Einstein with authority. And jolly fascinating stuff it is too. I particularly liked her jovial, gender champion line regarding space exploration, where she wrote, "A successful unmanned rocket launch," in brackets, that means that ladies can go. I hope she doesn't get penalised for her humour. She's now 20 and in her second year at the university, and I'm sure that she's always getting penalised for her humour, which is fabulous. I still find it remarkable that men and women, thank you daughter, could only contemplate, never mind attempt, to explore space only in the very recent past. Having the desire, knowledge, technology and hope to see what was out there is incredible, especially when we're still getting to grips with this planet and all its wonders. Were we hoping to encounter some other life form, or could it have been some dark psychological premonition that we were on course to muck up the planet only a few decades hence, and so might need an intergalactic bolt hole for our great-grandchildren, unless our children's reproductive systems are already doomed? Our innate curiosity as a species drives us forward to explore, to learn, to understand, construct, teach and share. So many marvellous achievements, great and small, have we made. Yet it also seems inherent in the human condition to harbour a darker tendency to control and conquer. That has always led to disaster and shameful behaviour, and so may herald our ultimate end. On the passing of some chap or other who had lived to a ripe old age, the British have a saying that they've had a good innings. So, in British parlance, you have the inevitable cricket references. I know cricket is a big thing.
Littered everywhere.
Littered everywhere, absolutely. But did we, as a species, have a good innings? Did the balance tip in favour of our good deeds? Or was it heavily weighted in favour of the not so nice, our 7-year-old again? Were our innings any great shakes? Your own heritage and history will steer you into what you think. As Brasilia, put again BSB, is depleted not just by school holidays, but by Rio +20, the world looks on. My husband flew out last Sunday morning to join the circus and to open a session. He knows a bit about climate change and food security, agriculture and environment and poverty. You know, all that unglamorous side of diplomacy and politics. Poor people and food and forests don't really set the politicians' pulses racing. You see when I wrote this, it's slightly different now. They're not, as Al Gore now knows, vote-winning issues. Well, not until we're all starving anyway, and then are you going to trust a portly politician? But I happen to like food and trees, and purely by circumstance of birth, luck or geography, we could have all been born or fallen into poverty. Climatic anomalies featured just the day before his flight to Rio. We were at my children's school Festa Junina, and in Brazil they have festivals in the summer, basically celebrating Harvest Festival, the abundance of earth and nature, and giving thanks for what is grown. And it started to rain, unheard of in June in Brazil. This didn't spoil anything. The assembled throng were full of giggles and puffed up parental pride, seeing our bilingual offspring dancing and singing and playing. But it did stimulate one of my friends, herself the daughter of a diplomat, whose husband was in the Brazilian Foreign Service, to look up at the heavens and utter, and they say climate change doesn't exist. I looked at my husband with the glance that couples have for their own secret codes. You all have them, right? Hours employed for climate change matters when so few really give a stuff is, well, it exists. It just ain't sexy. Rio Plus 20 brings hordes of delegations which, critics are fond of pointing out, make a mockery of carbon footprints. I'm not going to comment on the politics. Let's see what happens in the aftermath. The next 2 or 3 decades will give us a clue, as the last 2 or 3 have done. All I can say is that I'm so thankful that there will be credible experts engaged in these issues long after the Rio hotel invoices are met by various countries. And Rio breathes a sigh of relief as if to say, well, at least that whole circus is over for another 20 years. The garden of climate change is so far from rosy. How very, very sad. But as with space missions, there is always hope. Alongside our apparent need to control and conquer nature, rather than live in harmony with its dynamics, we seem to have a tendency to seek to control and demean our fellow human beings. This is at the forefront of my mind, having just finished reading a remarkable book about the American Civil War and the significant role that racial intolerance played in driving all manner of sins. Only 100 years separates the race and the space race, and both seem equally incredible and jaw-dropping in their own way. How utterly ignorant and misguided and hellish to think that one race is superior to another based on something such as skin pigment. And this went on for centuries. To use another race as unpaid labour to do menial and backbreaking, soul-destroying work to the sole benefit of another, the master. Unbelievable, isn't it? As unbelievable as walking on the moon. Documents setting out the atrocities held in the libraries of Congress and Harvard and the museums of Confederacy and the National Museum of Health and Medicine in Washington should be compulsory reading, lest we forget the acts of barbarism that were wrought in the name of civilizing those whose only difference was the colour of their skin, their racial descent, their heritage, their DNA. I read those accounts and I wanted to cry, and oftentimes do. I have no doubt that as the issue started to emerge, people might have thought it was wrong. Anti-slavery seemed unsexy, to use the common political parlance. Certainly not something that the country would go to war over. But in terms of its repercussions the world over, we are thankful that fair-minded, courageous men and women of all colours stood up for equality, liberty, freedom and independence. My own country, Sri Lanka, was part of the colonies and suffered its fair share under a range of unwelcome visitors or uninvited guests. The Kandyan kings were the last royal lineage of Sri Lanka and had survived the Dutch and the Portuguese invasions and rule without defeat. But sadly, and I am married to an Englishman, don't forget, the British had different ideas. Well, the Kandyan kings had had a good innings, hadn't they? My mother can trace her ancestors back to their line, and for what it's worth, still has the royal names as part of her heritage in her passport and on her birth certificate. Luckily, she doesn't hold grudges. As to the present day and my present place in racially democratic Brazil, I'm in constant amazement about the diversity of the Brazilian Brasilia community in terms of ethnicity and ethnic mix. It remains glorious to me and something that can't be taken for granted. There are people from all over the globe, and relationships, marriages and partnerships between people from all racial backgrounds. I almost take it for granted that we have such a social mix and that no one bats an eyelid. It is accepted and celebrated, a harvest of a different kind, as fruitful as any festa junina. And yet, not so long ago, it would be a crime for people like me and my husband, people with different skin colours, to have had a relationship, to fall in love and to have children. This would not only be illegal, but immoral. How many of you might this affect? Just as we have explained outer space and galaxies and dark matter, there will come a time when we will have to explain colonialism and slavery and civil war to our daughter and son. And then in time when they explain it back to us. Surely it's a sick joke, they may cry. No, my love, I will say. It's history, it's politics, it's diplomacy, it's heritage and legacy. And thank whatever forces you believe in, that you will not be chastised or enslaved or beaten or humiliated. I hope. Explaining this concept and past reality to an innocent child is a daunting prospect in itself. Houston, we have one big fat problem. When that child is of mixed race or heritage or hemisphere, or whatever you wish to term it, then it really can be a minefield. Whenever and however we choose to explain this particular dark matter, our own little spacecraft, manned and buoyed and girled by our unit of 4, will take a voyage into the unknown. But we will do so together, and in the knowledge that there are those who have gone before and made those giant leaps for man and womankind. Next time, part 2, Dark Matter the sequel, or The Empire Strikes Back, July 2012.